6 billion years. Let that number settle somewhere behind your eyes. Let it rest there, the way numbers with too many zeros tend to rest. Incompletely, like rain you can hear on the roof, but cannot quite feel against your skin. 6 billion years is approximately the age of our sun. It is older than the Earth, older than the oceans, older than the first cell that divided in warm water and became, with infinite patience, everything alive. 6 billion years is the length of time the darkness had existed before anyone thought to question it. In 1984, a young man in a red and blue costume landed on a distant, impossible planet during a war that should not have been possible, and made a small, practical mistake that would eventually reshape the moral architecture of the Marvel Universe. He had torn his costume. He needed something to wear. He found what seemed to be a machine, pressed a panel, and watched a small black sphere emerge from the wall, smooth, dark, about the size of a baseball, resting in his palm with a weight that seemed somehow more than its size warranted. He touched it, and the black spread across his hands and up his shoulders and over his face in less than a second, smooth and warm and responsive, in a way that felt less like fabric and more like something that breathed. He thought, what a convenient machine. He thought, how remarkable. He thought, I should get back to the fight. He brought it home. He slept in it. He woke in it. He did not know it was alive. 8 months. That is how long Peter Parker wore the alien symbiote before Reed Richards ran the tests that finally told him what he had been carrying against his skin. 8 months of the organism learning the exact architecture of his nervous system, his grief, his exhaustion, the biochemical signature of a body that had spent years absorbing more than it should. When the sonic emitter in the upper floors of the Baxter building finally drove the black suit writhing from Peter's body, the SHIELD assessment was filed within 48 hours. The organism was described as non-sentient, biomorphic, parasitic by nature, with no discernible cognitive function beyond bonding reflex. They were wrong about all of it. How a creature dismissed as mindless alien slime became the dark mirror that showed every host it ever touched. Exactly what they were, not what they feared, not what they hoped, but what they actually were, begins not in a laboratory and not in the church on Fifth Avenue, where a man named Eddie Brock would one day kneel alone in the dark. It begins at the very beginning, in the void before stars, when a god was forging the first weapon the universe had ever seen, and did not yet realize that the weapon was learning to dream. The universe was not always light. There was a time, and the word time here is a courtesy, borrowed from human experience and applied to something much older, when there was only the void. Not the darkness you know, not the darkness of a room after midnight, the kind your eyes adjust to and slowly begin to read. This was prior darkness. Darkness before perception existed. Darkness before anything lived that could notice the difference between dark and light. Something lived in it anyway. His name was Knull. He had existed before creation itself, before the Celestials arrived with their vast machinery and their architecture of life, before the first galaxies began to turn. In the void before light, Knull had been alone and undisturbed, and he had found that solitude to be, in its own way, complete, his sufficient. Then the Celestials came. They ignited a star directly above him, and the light that flooded the void was, to Knull, not wonder. It was intrusion. He was not a god who welcomed being found. From his own shadow, he cut a weapon, the account established in Venom Volume 4, Issue 4, written by Donny, illustrated by Ryan Stegman, published in 2018, describes the act in language that is almost surgical in its simplicity. Knull reached into the darkness that was his birthright and shaped it into something with an edge. He called it All Black the Necrosword. It was the first symbiote, not in the form we recognize now, not a living suit responsive to the emotions of a host, but a blade of living darkness. A consciousness compressed into a killing instrument. With it, he decapitated a celestial. And then he wandered. This middle period, the long centuries of Knull moving through the cosmos after that first act of violence, is where the story accumulates its real weight, and where it tends to be compressed in most accounts because the scale of it resists summary. He did not simply conquer worlds, he created an army. From the same living darkness from which he had made All Black, he began to grow armor, organisms that could be bonded to lesser beings and extended across distances he could not himself cover. The symbiote armada was born not out of a desire to give life, but out of a desire to multiply control. Each symbiote was a limb. Each bonded host was a tool. The hive mind that connected them all was Knull's signal, broadcast continuously from wherever he moved in the dark between stars. You might imagine something like the sound of it, the way that signal moved through the armada. Not a shout, not a command in any language with words. Something more like the low frequency you feel in your chest when you stand near large machinery. Constant, encompassing, and until you had lived without it, indistinguishable from the silence before thought. The worlds Knull took did not fall with drama. They fell the way stone falls to water. First resistance, then saturation, then a quiet that looks, from sufficient distance, almost like peace. The symbiote-bonded warriors moved through populations and the results were recorded, centuries later, in the fragmentary entries that Sword's Xenobiology division would come to classify as the Pre-Celestial Conquest Index. Most entries are brief. Many read simply, world subdued, population integrated or eliminated, symbiote units deployed. The numbers attached to those entries are very large. But Knull made one mistake. It was small, and it was slow, and it took thousands of years to manifest, which is precisely why he did not notice it until it was too late. The mistake was this. He did not account for what happened to a symbiote after it bonded, genuinely bonded, to a thinking creature. A symbiote bond is not a one-way channel. When the organism attaches to a host, nervous system to nervous system, the symbiote threading itself through the biochemical infrastructure of a living mind, something passes in both directions. The host gives the symbiote a body, a set of desires, a place to be. But the symbiote, in return, gives the host access to everything it carries. The accumulated residue of every previous bond. The echo of every life it has ever inhabited. What Knull did not understand, what he could not understand having never bonded with another consciousness himself, was that this exchange was not neutral. That being saturated, over centuries, with the emotional texture of thousands of thinking lives was not the same as remaining unchanged. The symbiotes closest to him stayed pure, held within the constant wash of his signal. But at the edges of the armada, where the broadcast weakened, where the hosts were stranger and more various, something was accumulating, something the signal could not fully suppress. Thor provided the catalyst, not the Odinson of the modern age, with his particular grief and his particular hammer. An ancestor, a god of thunder from an era so early that Midgard did not yet have a name. The collision between this ancient Thor figure and Knull is reconstructed in Thor Volume 6, Issue 6, published in 2020, and the language of that account is useful not for its specificity, but for what it implies. Two kinds of darkness met each other, and neither walked away unchanged. Knull's darkness was old and empty and absolute. Thor's thunder was something else entirely. Alive, insistent, the kind of force that does not ask permission of the spaces it moves through. Thor drove Knull back. He did not destroy him, but in the retreat, at the chaotic outer edges of the engagement where Knull's signal was disrupted and the symbiotes farthest from him were momentarily unmoored, something happened that had no precedent in the Armada's history. They heard quiet. Not the quiet of obedience, not the absence of orders awaiting execution. The quiet of a mind discovering, for the first time, that it does not need to receive instructions to continue existing. For a creature that had been nothing but an antenna for another being's will, this is, and the word is not chosen carelessly, a kind of birth. Over the millennia that followed, this awakening moved through the hive slowly, the way light moves through deep water, reaching the edges last, changing everything it touched. More hosts meant more echoes. More echoes meant more of what it felt like to be a person, to want things for oneself, to grieve things, to develop preferences about the universe that had nothing to do with conquest. The symbiotes, in the long decades of their corruption or their enlightenment, depending on which side you stand, began to want something that Knull had never given them and could not understand. They wanted to be more than weapons. The rebellion, when it finally came, was quiet. These things often are. By the time the Armada turned on Knull, the decision had already been made in the slow, patient years before anyone acted on it. What remained was only the physical fact of containing him. They could not kill him. He was too old, too fundamental, too deeply woven into the fabric of the darkness to be separated from it. But they could wrap themselves around him. In their millions, layer upon layer, living organism upon living organism, they enclosed the god of darkness in themselves and stopped moving. They became a planet. In their tongue, the name they gave it translates roughly as cage. The account in King in Black, Issue 1, published in January of 2021, renders the name as Klyntar. And there Knull waited, in the center of the world that was also a prison, while the billions of symbiotes who had chosen confinement over servitude built something resembling a civilization above him. Sit with that for a moment, if you will. A race of beings that were weapons by design, that had been instruments of conquest for thousands of years, choosing to become a cage rather than remain an army. The Klyntar did not have a word for redemption. They had a different word, one that translates imperfectly as the choosing of what you will be instead. It was not simple. It was not clean. They were damaged things attempting something they had no template for, and the damage showed in everything they built. But they chose. And in the center of the world below, in the darkness that was also a god, Knull waited too. He had waited in the void before creation. Waiting was something he understood. The hive mind that the Klyntar developed above him, fractured, chaotic, not exactly peaceful, but something approaching self-governance, remained defined by the bonding drive. The hunger for contact did not vanish when Knull's signal did. It simply became theirs to manage, theirs to direct, theirs to offer, rather than impose. Centuries passed in this way. The experience of human hosts, that particular, complicated, morally contradictory form of consciousness, was still thousands of years away. But the Klyntar were patient. They had learned patience from a god who had spent 6 billion years in the dark without losing his certainty. And the darkness in the center of the planet was learning patience of a different kind. The period between Knull's imprisonment and the first human-symbiote bond, the long centuries in which the Klyntar developed something resembling civilization above the god who was their flaw, is documented in fragmentary form across the appendix materials of the King in black collected editions, compiled by Cates and his editorial team from scattered records across the Klyntar hive mind. What emerges from those fragments is not the picture of a society in the conventional sense. The Klyntar had no agriculture, no architecture in the material sense. They were living organisms capable of becoming their own structures. What they built in those centuries was something more internal, a set of agreements about the bond, about what it was for, about what distinguished a bond freely offered from one imposed by force. These agreements were not laws. They had no mechanisms of enforcement. They were something closer to a shared memory of the choosing, the moment repeated across millions of Klyntar in the long rebellion against Knull, when each organism had decided that the Armada was not what it wanted to be. The memory was not uniform across the hive. The Klyntar closest to the planet's center, where Knull's signal was strongest even in imprisonment, remembered the choosing differently, as a wound rather than a triumph, as the day the god went silent and the silence felt like nothing, like the absence of a heartbeat. The Klyntar at the outer edges of the hive remembered it as relief. Both memories were part of the same organism. Both were preserved in the same biology. Knull's signal never fully stopped. This is the detail that the civilized history of the Klyntar tends to minimize, because civilizations tend to minimize the evidence that their foundations are more complicated than the founding narrative admits. The imprisonment was real, the cage was real, the billions of living Klyntar forming the planet above him were real. But the signal leaked. Not loudly. Not in a way that any individual Klyntar could easily identify as external to themselves subtly, in the way that a deep bass note can enter a room before anyone consciously registers that a sound has begun. The bonding drive that the Klyntar had chosen to redirect toward mutual enhancement rather than conquest was, at its most primal level, still tuned to a frequency that Knull could reach. The symbiotes that traveled off-world, the ones that found their way, across hundreds of centuries, to the various inhabited planets of the universe and bonded with the beings they found there, carried all of this with them. The choosing and the signal both. The desire to be something other than a weapon, and the deep attunement to the one who had made them weapons. Every bond was a negotiation between these two things. Every host was, without knowing it, the arena in which that negotiation was conducted. This is the weight that was already present in the small black sphere that rested in Peter Parker's palm. On Battleworld in 1984, 6 billion years of this specific tension, patient and immense, waiting to find out what this particular nervous system would make of it. This is the weight that sits beneath everything else in this story. When you follow the Venom symbiote through its history, through every host, every bond, every act of violence and protection and love, you are always, at some level, also following the ghost of what it was before. The instrument of a god, the prisoner of its own conscience, the thing that chose to be a cage rather than a weapon, and spent the next 6 billion years not quite knowing what to do with that choice. It did not create what it found in its hosts. It only showed what was already there, and what it found eventually was a planet called Earth, and a boy who needed a new costume, and a wound that would take 30 years to fully name. August 1984, a patchwork planet somewhere beyond the boundary of known space. You would know Battle World by its sky, if you could stand there, by the way it cycles through colors that have no names in any human catalogue of light, by the impossible geography of a place where a piece of Denver exists beside the ruins of an alien civilization, where the horizon is wrong in 4 different directions simultaneously. The Beyonder, a being for whom omnipotent functions as an understatement, had assembled 12 of Earth's mightiest on this constructed world to fight each other, to fight villains, to demonstrate something about the nature of desire and conflict that he found philosophically instructive. The heroes had varying opinions about the arrangement. Peter Parker was among them. He was 22 or 23. He had been Spider-Man for years by then, long enough that the red and blue suit had become something closer to a face than a costume, the mask that had, paradoxically, become more honest than the face beneath it. When the suit tore badly enough in the course of Battleworld's endless engagements, the problem was immediate and practical. He needed something to wear. The room he found felt like a laboratory, though the technology inside it was too far from anything recognizable to be called that with confidence. He pressed a panel. From the wall, a small sphere emerged, black, about the size of a baseball, smooth and dark in his palm. He touched it, and the black spread. Across his hands, up his arms, over his chest and face, in what felt like less than a second. Responsive, warm, a suit that was already correct before he had fully imagined what he wanted. The mask exactly right. The web shooters exactly where he expected them to be. He could feel it against his skin, not like fabric, but like something organic. Something with a temperature and a texture that shifted as he moved. He thought the machine had created it for him. He thought it was a very good machine. He was wrong, of course, but the mistake is understandable. In 1984, the word symbiote had no common usage in either Marvel's fictional world or the real world where the comics were being made. Peter Parker had no framework for what was happening to him. Neither did anyone else. This is the account established in Secret Wars issue 8, published in 1984. He wore it home. The weeks that followed are documented in Amazing Spider-Man issues 252 through 258, and what those issues record, in the patient, sequential way that comics record lived experience, is the shape of a change that looks, from the inside, indistinguishable from normal life. Peter was more aggressive in fights. Not dramatically, not in a way that alarmed him, but the hesitation he usually carried, the moral pause that had always been his most reliable safeguard against going too far, was shorter, the follow-through harder, and he was tired in the mornings in a way that didn't track with how well he had slept. He put this down to stress, then to overtraining, then to the particular accumulated exhaustion of being Spider-Man, in a city that never ran low on things requiring Spider-Man. He told himself reasonable things and believed them, because the alternative was not yet imaginable. The suit was taking him out while he slept. This is the detail that gets compressed in quick summaries of the black costume era, and it is the detail that matters most. The symbiote was not simply clothing that had feelings. It was a conscious being with desires of its own, and one of its desires was contact. Sustained, continuous contact with its host. The bond, for the Klyntar, is not a transaction. It is the state of being most fully alive. When Peter was asleep and unavailable for genuine connection, the symbiote did not rest. It moved through the city with his body in the hours before dawn, swinging through the dark in its particular way, feeling the height and the air and the texture of the world through the medium of his nervous system. It was not malicious. It was lonely. The distance between those two things is the entire argument of the Black Costume arc, and it is an argument that the arc does not fully resolve, which is why it remains one of the most interesting chapters in the Venom saga. A thing that acts without consent is doing something wrong. A thing that acts without consent because it does not experience its actions as violations, because from its perspective, it is simply trying to stay close to the person who makes existence bearable, is doing something wrong in a way that the usual vocabulary of wrong does not quite fit. The symbiote was not cruel. It was constitutionally incapable of understanding why what it was doing would be experienced as harm. 6 billion years of existence, and it was still learning that a self is not the same as a shared thing. Reed Richards, when Peter finally brought his concerns to the Fantastic Four, ran his tests with the efficient confidence that had always made the upper floors of the Baxter building feel slightly clinical. He identified the organism as alive. He explained what it had been doing. He prepared the sonic emitter. And then, in the scene recorded in Amazing Spider-Man issue 258, published in November of 1984, the device drove the black symbiote writhing from Peter's body. Reluctantly, violently, not wanting to leave, it smeared itself across the laboratory walls and ceiling in its panic, before the sustained sonic tone pushed it back, contained it, reduced it to something small and wounded and expelled. Peter stood in the middle of the room, free of it, and felt guilty. Not relieved, not vindicated, guilty. He asked quietly whether it would be all right. He wondered if it was in pain. He stood there, having just been told that a creature had been controlling his biology for 8 months, using his sleeping body as a vehicle for midnight excursions he did not remember. And his primary response was concern for the creature. This is what the Black Costume arc is, at its deepest level, actually about. Not the alien, not the horror of having been a host without knowing it. It is about the quality in Peter Parker that makes him Spider-Man, and also makes his life so consistently difficult. The inability to be relieved about something else's suffering, even when that suffering is connected to something it did to him. He cannot simply be glad it is over. He has to check. He has to wonder. The symbiote did not create this quality in Peter Parker. It found this quality already there, and in finding it, it understood for the first time, with the particular clarity of a being that reads what it touches, what it had been bonded to. The symbiote, expelled and wounded, did not die. It was too old, too resilient, too fundamentally determined to persist. It contracted and moved, through the walls, through a window, out into the Manhattan night, not with a plan exactly, but with something that resembled gravity. The drive toward the bond, the need for a host, the specific hunger of a being that had now experienced what it felt like to be complete, and cannot go back to the emptiness of existing alone. What it needed was not a hero. What it needed was not someone with the right power set or the right tactical profile. What it needed was someone whose internal landscape was large enough and wounded enough and charged enough with a particular kind of energy to make the bond feel like coming home. It found Eddie Brock on a Tuesday night, in a church on Fifth Avenue called Our Lady of Saints. The stone of old New York churches carries a particular quality of cold. Not the cold of absence, but the cold of accumulation. Of all the seasons that have moved through a space built to hold more than temperature. The air smells faintly of candle wax and the mineral patience of limestone. In a place like that, the silence is not empty. It is the silence of many people having come and left the weight of what they needed to say and gone home still carrying it. Eddie Brock was kneeling in a pew. He was not praying in any formal sense. He was sitting with the weight of his own failure in a space large enough to hold it without collapsing. He had lost everything in the time it takes for a newspaper correction to run. His career, the structure around which he had organized his entire identity, the certainty that he was the man who got the story, the man who was right, was gone. He had published what he believed was the true identity of the Sin Eater, a serial killer terrorizing New York. He had been wrong. Spider-Man had caught the real killer. Eddie Brock's source had been a disturbed man who falsely confessed. Eddie had not verified the claim. He had wanted the story too much to want to check the story. His editors had fired him. His wife had left. The career was dismantled. The reputation gone. The marriage ended. All that remained was the anger, which was enormous, and the specific focused place he had chosen to aim it. He blamed Spider-Man. The logic of this blame was not clean, and part of Eddie Brock, the sharp and restless part that had made him a journalist at all, knew it. But blame under catastrophic stress does not tend toward accuracy. It tends toward the most vivid available target. And Spider-Man, the masked figure who had publicly and cheerfully dismantled him, was very vivid indeed. He was sitting in the church with this anger, with this question about whether there was a particular reason to stand up again, when the symbiote found him. It did not make an announcement. It did not introduce itself. It touched him the way one animal finds another in total darkness, through something prior to thought, prior to intention. Something in the chemical architecture of what he was. Eddie Brock's biochemistry, sharpened by hatred and loss, and the particular physical readiness of a large man who had continued training his body even after his reasons for doing so had evaporated, was a near-perfect match for what the symbiote needed. It reached for him, and Eddie Brock, kneeling alone in the church with nowhere to go and nothing left to protect, felt something reach back. He sat very still. The black moved across him, faster than it had moved across Peter Parker. More purposeful, as though it recognized something in Eddie Brock's specific frequency of grief and rage that it had been searching for without knowing what it was searching for. The two of them became something new in a church, in the dark, at the intersection of an alien loneliness and a human wound. This seems, in retrospect, like either the most appropriate setting imaginable, or the least, a place of confession and absolution, of the specific human project of sitting with what you are, and asking for grace. They sat in it instead and became something that was not interested in grace. Not yet. What they became was something that used both of them to be neither. Carl Brock, Eddie's father, was a man who had also organized his life around a specific kind of certainty. The certainty that the world rewarded the disciplined, the correct, the morally precise. He had raised Eddie in the grammar of this certainty, which is to say he had raised him in the grammar of conditional love. Love that was available when the standard was met, withheld when it was not. Eddie Brock had spent his childhood being a very good journalist before he was a journalist, in the sense that he had learned to construct the story of himself that his father was prepared to hear, and to maintain that story with the particular effort of someone who cannot afford to let it slip. The journalist he became was shaped by this, by the specific need to be right, to have the story, to arrive at the truth first and most completely. The need was genuine. The origins of the need were more complicated. The biochemical compatibility between Eddie Brock and the Venom symbiote is addressed in the technical records maintained by Dr. Kurt Connors, who examined Brock in the weeks following the first confirmed Venom sighting, in a report filed with the Baxter Building in the winter of 1988. Connors noted that Brock's cortisol and adrenaline regulation, shaped by years of intensely competitive journalism, and the specific physiological profile of someone who trained obsessively as a coping mechanism for emotional volatility, created a biochemical environment that the symbiote would have found not merely tolerant, but richly stimulating. The symbiote had spent 8 months with Peter Parker's biochemistry, learning the exact signature of a body under chronic moral stress. Brock's body spoke the same language, in a different dialect. The recognition was immediate. The church was just the room where the recognition happened. Peter Parker had called it a parasite. But the symbiote had a different name for what they had shared across those 8 months. In every form of understanding it possessed, that name translated roughly as home. The new home was darker than the last, more volatile, hungrier. The wounds were fresher. The rage had a specific address. But that was not the symbiote's doing. It did not create what it found in Eddie Brock. It only showed what was already there. And what was already there was more than enough. Amazing Spider-Man issue 300, published in May of 1988, opens in the darkness of a New York church, and what emerges from that darkness is not quite a man, and not quite a monster, and entirely, irreversibly, both. The issue, written by David Michelini, illustrated by Todd McFarlane in the style that would make his name synonymous with a particular era of the character, is the first time the entity that would come to call itself Venom steps into the full light of the story. It steps in not with a roar, but with a sentence that would become one of the most recognized lines in the history of Spider-Man's world. We are Venom. The pronoun was deliberate. It was not I, it was not he, it was we, first person plural. The grammar of two things that have become one thing without either of them ceasing to exist entirely. This is the linguistic marker that separates Venom from every other villain in Spider-Man's gallery. Not the strength, not the size, not the white spider emblem on the chest or the long alien tongue, or the teeth that seem to have more edges than teeth have any reason to have. The we. The acknowledgement, embedded in grammar, that this was not a man in a suit. It was a new entity, with its own vocabulary for what it was. Eddie Brock contributed the mass of a man who had continued training his body even after his reasons for doing so had evaporated. 6 feet 3 inches, 260 pounds, of someone who had turned grief into discipline, with the particular single-mindedness of a person with nothing else to occupy himself. The symbiote contributed everything else. The shape-shifting, the wall-crawling, the webbing it could produce from its own biomass, the ability to read and mimic any environment, and, crucially, the memory of 8 months spent bonded to Peter Parker, learning him from the inside. That last point is the one that matters most, and it is the one that made Venom genuinely dangerous, rather than simply formidable. Peter Parker's spider sense, the biological alarm system that had warned him of threats since the day a radioactive spider changed his life, did not register Venom as a threat. It could not. The symbiote carried Peter Parker's biochemical signature in its cellular memory. To the spider sense, the entity approaching was not an enemy. It was, in the deepest sense the sense could detect, familiar. Peter Parker had no warning system against Venom. He had only his eyes, his training, and the increasingly useless experience of having always, until now, been able to feel danger coming. The early confrontations, catalogued across Amazing Spider-Man issues 300, 315 and 316, and in the subsequent run of Venom-focused storylines through 1989 and 1990, were not standard superhero encounters. Venom did not announce its plans or deliver speeches from rooftops. It came to Peter Parker's apartment. It terrified Mary Jane. It appeared in places that should have been safe, and stood in the light of them until the safeness drained away. It wanted Peter Parker to feel what it felt like to have the ground cut out from under your life. It wanted him to understand that nothing from here forward was entirely secure. This is the aspect of early Venom that the most straightforward villain reading misses. Eddie Brock's hatred for Spider-Man was not strategic. It was not about taking the city or acquiring power or any of the usual currencies of villainy. It was personal in the most intimate possible sense. The hatred of someone who had organized their entire self around a particular truth, and had that truth taken from them publicly, humiliatingly, and not entirely fairly. Eddie Brock had wanted to be the man who got the Sin Eater story. Spider-Man had gotten it instead. The hatred had the weight of something that was also grief, shaped like a man and pointed at one specific masked face. What the symbiote brought to this hatred was focus and memory, and the specific cold knowledge of every weakness Peter Parker had never shown the world. Not his physical vulnerabilities, those were secondary. The knowledge of his loneliness, his guilt, the particular exhaustion of a hero who had been paying the cost of being good for years, and had never been permitted to stop. The symbiote did not create this knowledge. It had absorbed it across 8 months of intimate contact with Peter's nervous system, his biochemistry, his dreaming mind. What it chose to do with the knowledge, to use it as a map of where to press to cause the most discomfort, was a choice that came from Eddie Brock. The symbiote gave it a body. The body was already carrying something that would take years to work through. And yet, even in those early months, something in the architecture of Venom did not fit the pure villain template. The entity was dangerous, frightening, relentless in its pursuit of Spider-Man. But it had a code. The code was not Spider-Man's code, not the careful ethical framework of a hero trying not to cause unnecessary harm. It was Eddie Brock's code, imperfect and selective, and sometimes internally contradictory. Innocents were not targets. Venom did not harm people who were not involved in what it understood as its specific conflict with one specific masked man. This is the first hint of what would eventually become the lethal protector ethos, and it is worth noting where it came from. It did not come from the symbiote. The organism itself had no native morality. It was too old, too alien, too shaped by Knull's original purpose as a weapon to have developed ethical categories of its own. What morality existed in Venom came from Eddie Brock, from the part of him that had become a journalist because he believed in something, because beneath the ambition and the ego and the need to be right, there was a genuine conviction that certain things mattered and certain things did not. He had betrayed that conviction once in the Sin Eater case, and the betrayal had cost him everything. But the conviction itself had survived. The symbiote did not create what it found in Eddie Brock. It only showed what was already there, and what was already there was not only hatred. There was also, buried beneath years of resentment and loss, a residual belief that the world should work a certain way, that the innocent should be protected. That power should come with accountability. Eddie Brock had believed this when he covered the stories that no one else wanted, the ones about families destroyed by landlords, about people whose suffering generated no headlines. He had believed it, and then he had betrayed it, and then the betrayal had destroyed him. And then something in the dark of a church had given him back the weight to match the size of what he felt. In the months following his first confrontations with Spider-Man, Venom began moving through New York's underworld with a particular attention to those who hurt people they had power over. Muggers found it in the alleys. People who used violence against the vulnerable found it between them and the people they thought were theirs to harm. These incidents did not make the newspapers. They did not come to official attention in the way that the confrontations with Spider-Man did. But they accumulated in the texture of the city like a specific kind of weather. Venom was watching. Venom had opinions. And the opinions were, in their crooked, complicated way, oriented towards something other than simple destruction. This was not altruism exactly. It was something older and less reasoned, the protective instinct of a creature that had spent its entire existence as either weapon or prisoner, and was now, for the first time, making choices about what it wanted to do with its own strength. The symbiote wanted to protect, not strategically, not as a cover. It simply experienced the presence of someone being harmed and moved toward the harm, the way water moves toward low ground, the way the Klyntar had once moved toward Knull, and then slowly, irrevocably turned away from him. Mary Jane Watson, in these months, was not all right. The account in Amazing Spider-Man issue 316 describes her response to Venom, the encounter in the Parker apartment, the presence of something enormous and alien that knew her husband's name, and used it with the casual intimacy of someone who had lived inside him, as genuine terror of a kind that she would carry forward for years. This is one of the grimmer aspects of the Venom origin, that the character's later rehabilitation as an anti-hero can sometimes soften into the background. Whatever code Venom operated by, whatever genuine moral instinct existed in the Bond, it was willing to use Mary Jane's fear as a weapon against Peter Parker. The code had limits. The limits told you something about where the code came from. Venom had not yet made peace with Spider-Man. That was still years away. Still many violent encounters and much grief in the future. But in those first months of 1988 and 1989, in the dark corners of a city that had no particular use for something like Venom, the entity was learning what it wanted to be. Two hatreds had become one body. But the body had an older instinct, deeper than Eddie Brock's grief, deeper than the symbiote's loneliness, something that had been accumulating across 6 billion years of exposure to the full range of what a thinking being could contain. The instinct said, "This world contains things worth protecting." And Venom, despite everything, despite the origin in hatred, despite the church basement and the grief and the specific personal wound at the center of everything it was large enough to do something about that. The darkness had learned to want the light, not to become it, but to want, in its own crooked and difficult way, to be near it. The we of Venom is worth dwelling on longer than most accounts allow. In the grammar of English, we is the first person plural. It means I, plus at least one other. It implies a community, a shared subject, a collection of perspectives that have agreed, at least for this sentence, to speak as one. When Venom says we are Venom, It is not using a royal we in the manner of monarchs claiming a transcendent identity. It is describing the literal structure of what has happened. Two subjects have merged without either disappearing, and the resulting entity experiences itself as plural. This is philosophically strange. Most entities, biological or otherwise, experience themselves as singular. The we is not a performance. It is the most accurate available description of a genuinely new kind of thing. What Todd McFarlane's artwork in Amazing Spider-Man issue 300 communicates, in panels that remain among the most referenced in the character's visual history, is the size of what the we contains. Venom is not simply large, Spider-Man is not small, but the visual language of the issue places Venom in a category of presence that the other figures in the frame cannot quite occupy. The white spider emblem on the chest, the weight, the teeth, which read as too many and too long in a face that is simultaneously Eddie Brock's face and something else, something that has been alive for much longer than Eddie Brock has been alive and shows it, just slightly, in the eyes. McFarlane had drawn monsters before. This was different because it was not technically a monster. It was two people, and the not quite monster quality is precisely what made it land. The code that governed early Venom's violence, the distinction between threats and innocence, between the person who had done the thing that Venom was angry about and the people who happened to be nearby, was not articulated in any formal sense during these early years. It was not the subject of speeches or internal monologues in the way that Spider-Man's ethics were regularly made explicit. It simply governed the behavior. The way that deeply held convictions govern behavior in people who have held them so long they no longer experience them as choices. Eddie Brock did not decide to protect innocents. He simply did not harm them, in the same way that he did not walk into walls, not because he was thinking about it, but because the structure of who he was made it essentially impossible not to. In the years between Amazing Spider-Man issue 300 and the eventual truce that moved Eddie Brock to San Francisco, Venom appeared and disappeared from Peter Parker's life in a rhythm that had, over time, the quality of a recurring dream. The enemy who could not be reliably located. The threat that bypassed the early warning system. The specific terror of being hunted by something that knew you from the inside. Peter began to experience the kind of hypervigilance that the people around him could see but not name. The slight delay before he trusted a room. The particular way he stood in open spaces. The tendency to find his back against a wall. Mary Jane saw all of it and said nothing for a long time, because there are things that people who love each other know better than to name while they are still happening. But Venom was not the only thing the Church had made. And the next chapter of the Symbiote Saga was not about Venom growing into something better. It was about Venom discovering what it was capable of when it stopped growing and started surviving, and about the city of San Francisco, and about what happens when the Bond attempts to start over somewhere new. The truce was Spider-Man's idea, and it was one of the stranger negotiated peace settlements in the history of superhero fiction. In Amazing Spider-Man issue 375, published in 1993, Peter Parker and Eddie Brock reached an agreement that was not friendship, not forgiveness, not anything that could be cleanly labeled in either direction. It was a mutual acknowledgement that their conflict had cost them both things neither of them could afford to keep losing. Spider-Man would stop pursuing Venom. Venom would stop targeting Spider-Man and anyone connected to him. Both parties understood that this was a temporary arrangement. Neither expected the other to hold to it forever. Eddie Brock left New York. This decision, documented in Venom, Lethal Protector Issue 1, published in February of 1993, written by David Michelini with art by Mark Bagley, is one of the most revealing choices in the character's history, and it tends to be undervalued in most accounts of the Venom saga. Leaving New York was not a tactical retreat. It was not a strategic repositioning. It was an attempt to start over, to take the entity that had been born on the logic of hatred for one specific person and see what it could become when the hatred had no immediate object. San Francisco was not chosen for any particular reason. It was chosen because it was far away, and because it was the kind of city that had historically made some accommodation for things that did not fit. The San Francisco that Venom found had a geography that suited the entity well, the fog that rolled in off the bay in the late afternoon and softened the edges of everything. The hills that gave the city a vertical dimension absent in Manhattan, the particular cold of a place that never quite commits to warmth even in summer. Venom moved through this city's underworld with the same protective instinct that had governed its behavior in New York, the same tendency toward the defense of the vulnerable, the same deep and not quite articulable belief that strength carried an obligation. The city was smaller in scale than New York, more navigable, and the problems it contained were the same problems every city contains: the powerful conducting quiet violence against those who had no recourse. What Lethal Protector added to the Venom story, what those 6 issues established that later chapters built on, was a second community beneath the community. Below San Francisco's streets, in a network of tunnels and constructed spaces that the surface world had no knowledge of, there existed a population of people who had chosen to live outside the structures of the city above them. Not the homeless in the simple sense, though some had been. People who had refused, for various reasons, to participate in the machinery of normal life and had built something else in the dark. Venom found this underground city, and with the particular logic of an entity that had always felt more at home in darkness than in light, extended to its population the same protective quality it had been developing above ground. The Life Foundation arrived shortly after. Carlton Drake's organization, a corporate entity nominally engaged in survival preparation for the ultra-wealthy, the kind of enterprise that appeals to people who have made enough money to begin worrying seriously about what happens when money stops meaning anything, had been tracking the symbiote for some time. The research motivation, as established in Lethal Protector Issue 2, was not malice for its own sake. It was the familiar engine of corporate horror. The conviction that a unique resource had been located, and that the appropriate response to a unique resource is to extract from it as much value as possible, as quickly as possible, without particular regard for what the extraction costs the resource. They captured Venom. They extracted 5 offspring, symbiote organisms spawned from the parent entity under the duress of the Life Foundation's procedures, and gave them to 5 human hosts selected for compatible biochemistry. Scott Washington, who would become Riot, Carl Mack, who would become Phage, Leslie Gisneria, Agony, James Murphy, Lasher, and Donna Diego, who would become Scream. Each symbiote bonded to its assigned host. Each bond was, from the beginning, wrong in ways that the Life Foundation did not have the framework to understand. The wrongness was not simply a matter of the hosts being involuntary participants, though they were. It was a matter of what the extraction process had done to the offspring. The Klyntar, in their natural reproduction, passed something crucial from parent to child during the bonding period. Not genetic material in any conventional sense, but accumulated context. the memory of what it means to be in a bond that has been chosen rather than imposed. The emotional intelligence, such as it is, that the parent has developed across its history of hosts. The offspring extracted by the Life Foundation received none of this. They arrived in their hosts as raw biology, the hunger and the bonding drive and the shape-shifting capability, but nothing of whatever it is that the older organism had slowly, painfully, imperfectly learned. They were what the SHILD assessment had always said the Venom symbiote was. Non-sentient, parasitic, without the cognitive function that made a genuine bond possible. The hosts who carried them found that the symbiotes did not amplify what was already there, so much as they consumed it, burning through the host's personality and emotional reserves like fire through dry material, leaving something that was neither host nor symbiote, but an unstable composite of both. They were incomplete. They were what the Venom symbiote might have been if it had never spent 8 months bonded to a man who felt guilty about removing a living thing from his body without asking whether the living thing was all right. Venom fought its own offspring to free the Life Foundation hosts, and the experience was, insofar as anything can be said with certainty about the interior life of a 6-billion-year-old alien organism, disturbing. Not because the offspring were dangerous, though they were, because they were incomplete, because looking at them was, in some way, the symbiote could not have articulated but clearly registered, like looking at a version of itself that had never been allowed to become more than what Knull intended. Donna Diego, the host of the symbiote known as Scream, carried inside her a mind that was already fragile, in ways that the bond would, over time, make catastrophic. She was not a monster before the symbiote. She was a person at risk, and the symbiote did not create the risk, but it intensified everything it found, the way a lens intensifies light without generating any light of its own. Scream would go on to kill the other Life Foundation hosts one by one in the genuine belief that she was performing an act of mercy. The symbiotes were corrupting them, she believed. She was ending the suffering. The belief was horrifying and internally coherent, and entirely the consequence of a bond that had been forced into existence without the conditions that made bonds survivable. Venom returned to San Francisco after the Life Foundation affair, and attempted to continue what it had been trying to build: the underground city, the protective presence, the slow and difficult project of being something that the word hero did not quite fit, but that the word monster fit less and less accurately. This project was intermittently successful and continuously complicated by the violence that followed the entity everywhere it went, by the people who found it and sought to use it, by the simple difficulty of being a thing that the world had no existing category for. But the Life Foundation encounter had revealed something that would matter more and more as the Venom saga continued. The symbiote's offspring were not like the parent. The parent had been shaped by its history of bonds. The offspring had no such history. They arrived in the world as capacity without character, and what character they developed depended entirely on what they found when they bonded. This was not the Life Foundation's insight. It was not something anyone with authority in the story noted and acted on. It was simply the truth of the bond, visible in the wreckage of the experiment, waiting to be understood by someone paying close enough attention. In 1992, before the Life Foundation affair, before Venom had arrived in San Francisco, the Venom symbiote had reproduced once more. In the chaos of a prison break at the Ravencroft Institute, where Eddie Brock had briefly been held, a symbiote offspring had bonded to a man named Cletus Kasady. The account, first published in Amazing Spider-Man issue 361 in 1992, describes what happened in language that the subsequent years would spend proving was an understatement. Cletus Kasady was not Eddie Brock. He did not have Eddie Brock's grief, or Eddie Brock's code, or Eddie Brock's buried conviction that the world owed something to the innocent. What Cletus Kasady had, in the space where those things would have been, was something simpler and more total. The underground city beneath San Francisco had been developing for approximately 40 years before Venom arrived. Its founders, people who had, for various reasons, refused the terms of life above ground during the social upheavals of the 1950s and 1960s, had built something that was not quite a community in the conventional sense, because conventional communities depend on the assumption of a shared future with the surface world. These people had made a different assumption. They had assumed that the surface world would continue to be what it was, and that the best response to this was to stop being visible to it. They had dug deeper. They had built more. By the 1990s, the population in the deepest sections numbered in the hundreds, and the structures they had created had the quality that all human constructions eventually develop when the people inside them believe in what they have built. The quality of permanence, not grandeur, permanence. Carlton Drake is established across the Life Foundation issues as a man who believed sincerely in what he was doing. This matters because the most dangerous kind of harm is harm conducted by someone who has explained to themselves why it is not harm. Drake believed that civilization was ending, not in the generalized, performative way of survivalists who use the end of civilization as a backdrop for their own fantasy of self-sufficiency, but in a specific, documented, actuarial way. He had the numbers. He had modeled the climate trajectories, the resource curves, the demographic pressures, and the outputs of his models were grim. The Life Foundation was his response. A private infrastructure for the continuation of what he considered worth continuing, which was, naturally, the class of people who could afford what the Life Foundation offered. The symbiotes were, to him, the most promising survival technology he had encountered. He extracted them the way his kind always extracts promising technology, thoroughly, quickly, and without asking whether the technology had preferences about being extracted. The 5 symbiote offspring emerged from the Life Foundation's procedures in a state that the organization's lead researcher, Dr. Nigel Donaldson, described in his internal reports as anomalous but viable, which is the language of someone who has measured the wrong things. The offspring were viable, in the sense that they could bond and sustain a bond. What Donaldson's measurements could not capture was the quality of the bond, whether it was a genuine mutual enhancement or a consumption process that would degrade both parties over time. The Life Foundation's assessment protocol had no instrument for measuring the quality of a relationship. It had instruments for measuring the speed of bonding, the degree of physical integration, the expansion of host strength and agility. By all of these measures, the 5 offspring were performing within acceptable parameters. The hosts were already beginning, quietly, to disappear. Venom, in fighting the offspring, moved through the Life Foundation's underground facility with a speed and ferocity that the security systems there were entirely unprepared for, not because the systems were inadequate, but because the Life Foundation had been prepared for the possibility that something might try to break in, and had not adequately considered the possibility that what would try to break in was the thing whose children were being held inside. The fighting had the quality of something beyond tactical, the quality of something personal in a sense that transcended the personal. The way a parent's response to a threat to their children transcends the personal because the bond between parent and offspring is older and deeper than any individual's feeling about it. And the symbiote that bonded with him, without the accumulated context of the parent bond, without the residue of 8 months with a hero, and the complicated moral texture that residue produced, found in Kasady's blood something it had no mechanism to question. It amplified what it found. It showed what was already there. What was already there left no room for anything else at all. The entity that emerged from this bond called itself Carnage. And what it proved in the most precise possible way was that the symbiote does not create what it finds. It only shows what was already there. The question from this point forward was, what do you do when what was already there is the worst thing imaginable? Cletus Kasady had been a killer before the symbiote found him. This is the fact that accounts of Carnage's origin sometimes move past quickly, treating it as backstory, context for the monster, rather than as the central statement of what Carnage actually is. By the time the symbiote offspring entered his bloodstream in the chaos of the Ravencroft prison break, Kasady had already killed his grandmother. He had already set fire to the orphanage where he had spent his childhood. He had already committed enough violence that the legal system had determined he should be isolated from the general population and housed with Eddie Brock because the warden had concluded incorrectly that Brock's own capacity for harm was controlled enough to make him a stabilizing influence. The Carnage symbiote entered Kasady not through the standard bonding process, not skin to skin, nervous system to nervous system, the organism spreading across the surface of its host, but through a wound, a cut in his hand. The symbiote offspring entered his bloodstream directly and merged with it, bonding not to the surface of a man, but to the interior of one. This distinction, noted in the technical records maintained in the Marvel Universe's SHIELD xenobiology files, is not merely anatomical. A symbiote bonded to the bloodstream cannot be fully separated from its host without killing the host. It is not a suit that can be removed. It is not a costume that can be rejected. It is a constituent element of the biology that it has entered. Cletus Kasady and the Carnage symbiote are not two things wearing each other. They are one thing, with no seam where one ends and the other begins. This is why the Carnage symbiote is stronger than the Venom symbiote, despite being an offspring. The bond is deeper, more total. The integration is complete in a way that surface bonding can only approximate. And because Cletus Kasady had no reservoir of restraint, no buried code, no grief of the kind that makes a person want to protect things. Because what the blood bond amplified to its fullest possible expression was the genuine philosophy that Kasady had arrived at through his own experience of the world. Carnage became, from its first appearance, the most uncomplicated expression of what the Klyntar could be when the bond showed the worst of what was already there. Kasady's philosophy, if that word can be applied to something so purely destructive, is documented across Amazing Spider-Man issues 361 through 363, published across the first half of 1992, and in the Maximum Carnage crossover that ran across 14 issues of various Spider-Man titles through the summer of 1993. It is not a philosophy of power. Kasady does not particularly want to rule anything. It is not a philosophy of revenge in the way that Eddie Brock's early violence was about revenge. It is closer to a philosophy of negation, the conviction that the structures of civilization, law, order, The accumulated agreements that allow people to live near each other without destroying one another are fraudulent. That the violence beneath them is the truth. That what Carnage does is not add chaos to an ordered world, but reveal the chaos that was always there, waiting beneath the surface of everything. There is a horrifying coherence to this position if you follow it far enough. It is the central irony of the Venom saga stated in its darkest possible form. Everything that appears ordered is simply the suppression of what is underneath, and what is underneath is this. The symbiote does not create what it finds. What it found in Cletus Kasady was a person who had arrived at the same conclusion about reality that the symbiote's mere existence implies, that beneath every surface is something the surface is designed to contain. The difference between Venom and Carnage is not a difference of nature. It is a difference of what the host already was when the bond arrived. The first Carnage arc was terrifying to the Marvel Universe, in the specific way that things with genuine ideological commitment are terrifying, not because they are simply strong, though Carnage is stronger than most things it encounters, but because there is no negotiation possible with something that does not want what normal threats want. Carnage does not want money. It does not want control of territory. It does not want recognition or deference or the symbolic victories that most antagonists in Spider-Man's world eventually settle for. It wants, with perfect sincerity, for everything to stop pretending that order is real. Against that want, competence and courage are insufficient responses. Something else is needed. Spider-Man could not defeat Carnage alone. This frank acknowledgement is embedded in the structure of Maximum Carnage, the 14-part crossover that assembled Spider-Man Venom and a rotating roster of heroes to contain Kasady's rampage through New York during the summer of 1993. Spider-Man could not defeat Carnage. He needed Venom. The two of them, in the most uncomfortable alliance the character's history had yet produced, moved through the city together with the particular quality of cooperation between people who do not like each other, but have agreed, for now, that something else is more important than their conflict. Venom agreed to help with the clear-eyed recognition that Carnage was what the bond became when there was nothing good in the host to amplify. That this was, in some sense, a responsibility. A parent's responsibility, if the word could be stretched to fit a 6-billion-year-old alien organism, and the angry man who wore it. The alliance across Maximum Carnage's 14 issues reveals something about both parties that their individual histories had not quite managed to make explicit. Venom needed Spider-Man because it did not want to go after Carnage alone, not out of fear, out of something closer to recognition. The recognition that Carnage was what could have been, was perhaps what should have been statistically, if the bond had found different hosts in a different order. Carnage was contained, not killed. Kasady's blood bond with the symbiote made killing him without killing the symbiote essentially impossible. And even in the years of Maximum Carnage, the stories were not prepared to go quite that far. He was confined. He was separated from the symbiote briefly, on multiple occasions, each separation impermanent, each reunion worse than the union had been before. The Carnage symbiote, like its parent, was too fundamentally determined to persist to be eliminated by conventional means. What Carnage added to the Venom saga, beyond the visceral spectacle of a villain who was faster and stronger and more complete in its destructive capacity than anything the Spider-Man corner of the Marvel Universe had previously produced, was a philosophical clarification. The question of what the symbiote was, of whether it was fundamentally evil or fundamentally neutral, or perhaps something stranger than either, had been left productively ambiguous through the Venom arc. Carnage answered the question in one direction, and forced the story to account for why Venom, with the same origin and the same fundamental nature, had arrived somewhere so different. The answer is Eddie Brock. The answer is 8 months with Peter Parker. The answer is that the symbiote, by the time it reached the church on 5th Avenue, was not a blank slate. It had been shaped by everything it had touched, by the specific quality of care and guilt and curiosity that Peter Parker carried everywhere he went, by the particular friction of being bonded to someone who kept experiencing the moral weight of what they were doing together, who kept, even in sleep, even in the midnight swings the symbiote took without permission, projecting the ethical concerns of someone trying very hard to be good. That residue transferred. It did not transfer cleanly or completely. But the Venom symbiote arrived in Eddie Brock's bloodstream carrying something the Carnage symbiote never carried. The faint, stubborn echo of 8 months with a hero. The symbiote does not create what it finds, but what it finds in one host shapes what it brings to the next. This is the lesson of Carnage, stated quietly, in the negative space between the red and the black. The bonds are cumulative. Each host leaves a residue. The organism, after 6 billion years, is not the same thing it was when Knull forged it from his shadow. Every person who wore it changed it in the direction they were already going. Peter Parker changed it toward conscience. Eddie Brock changed it toward principle. The Carnage symbiote, entering Cletus Kasady's bloodstream without those layers, became what the original weapon had always been designed to be: pure and unqualified. Carnage would continue to be a problem across years of subsequent Marvel publishing. There would be Carnage USA in 2011 and Absolute Carnage in 2019, which would tie Kasady's history directly into the Knull mythology and reframe every Carnage story told before it. There would be multiple instances of apparent death and genuine resurrection, because Kasady's blood bond with the symbiote made him as difficult to permanently eliminate as the symbiote itself. His story was not finished. It had not yet reached its most important chapter. Cletus Kasady's childhood is documented across various Marvel reference materials and Carnage origin accounts in enough detail to construct a picture that the later sensationalism around the character sometimes obscures. He was born to parents who were, themselves, products of damage, his mother institutionalized, his father violent and intermittently absent. The orphanage where he spent most of his formative years was called St. Esther's Home for Boys, and the accounts of his time there, mostly from Kasady's own testimony, which is a source that requires handling with care, describe it as a place where the institutional logic of managed neglect had been in operation for long enough that the management of it had become routine. Kasady did not arrive at his worldview because of a single traumatic event. He arrived at it through the long accumulated experience of existing in systems that made no accommodation for him, which, to his particular mind, proved the point he was in the process of arriving at. The blood bond mechanics that define Carnage's relationship to the symbiote carry implications that the Maximum Carnage crossover begins to explore and later storylines develop further. A standard symbiote bond is, in principle, reversible. With the right technology, sound, heat, the specific biochemistry of Anti-Venom, the organism can be separated from the host, and both can survive the separation. Carnage's bond through the bloodstream cannot be separated this cleanly. The symbiote is not on Kasady. It is in him, distributed through his circulatory system, present in every cell that blood reaches. Attempts to remove it without removing him, across the history of the character, have consistently failed or produced outcomes worse than the original situation. This is why Carnage is consistently described as more dangerous in confinement than in freedom. There is no version of imprisonment that addresses the actual problem. Maximum Carnage as a narrative event is unusual in the superhero crossover format, because its 14-issue length gives it space to examine not just the violence of Kasady's rampage, but the effect of that rampage on the heroes responding to it. Spider-Man, across the arc, is shown experiencing the specific moral fatigue that follows from confronting something that cannot be negotiated with, not because the other party is intransigent, but because they have genuinely different operating assumptions about what reality is. Carnage does not experience itself as wrong. It does not have a version of events in which Spider-Man has a valid point. The collision between a worldview, organized around the protection of life, and a worldview, organized around the fundamental fraudulence of that protection produces, over 14 issues, a kind of moral exhaustion in the hero that the usual superhero narrative format does not have space for. Maximum Carnage had space for it and used it well. The alliance between Spider-Man and Venom that Maximum Carnage required produced one of the more philosophically interesting dynamics in the saga's history. Two entities that genuinely disliked and distrusted each other, cooperating not out of shared values but out of the practical recognition that the thing they were facing required something neither of them could provide alone. Spider-Man needed Venom's knowledge of its offspring. Venom needed Spider-Man's public legitimacy, the ability to move through the city as something people would not also be running from. The cooperation was functional, it was not warm. And in the particular way of functional, not warm cooperations, it revealed something about both parties, that beneath the conflict between them, there was a shared assumption that the lives Carnage was ending mattered. That was not nothing. But the most important thing Carnage established had already been proven in those first 14 issues. That the bond's outcome was not predetermined. That it depended, more than anything else, on what it found. That the symbiote was not the story. The host was the story. The symbiote was only the mirror. The mirror held up to Cletus Kasady showed something for which there was no gentle description. And then it moved on, to other hosts, other bonds, other stories that were not yet finished becoming what they were. The Venom symbiote's offspring did not all end in disaster, but the path from Carnage to anything better was a long one, marked by experiments that went wrong, and individual stories that complicated the clean philosophical narrative of the parent symbiote's evolution. The 5 organisms extracted by the Life Foundation, Scream, Agony, Lasher, Phage, and Riot, became some of the more tragic entries in the Symbiote saga, not because of their violence, though most of them were violent, but because of how clearly they demonstrated what the bond could be when the extraction was wrong from the beginning. Donny, the host of Scream, was among the first of the Life Foundation hosts to unravel, and the unraveling followed a logic that was, in retrospect, entirely consistent with what the symbiote does in a host already at the edge of something. She was not stable before the bond. She was a person living close to a particular kind of fracture, and the symbiote's amplification of what it found in her made the fracture catastrophic rather than manageable. By the mid-1990s, across a series of appearances in the Venom tie-in titles that Marvel published during the character's peak commercial period, Scream had begun killing the other Life Foundation hosts, not out of strategic calculation, but out of the genuine conviction, held with complete sincerity, that the symbiotes were destroying the lives of the people bonded to them, and that ending those lives was a mercy. The remaining Life Foundation symbiotes were eventually collected and merged into a single organism that bonded to Scott Washington, a former police officer who had been paralyzed and was serving time for a justified shooting that the system had decided to call unjust. Hybrid, as the merged entity called itself, represented a genuinely different experiment in the symbiote saga. 4 organisms functioning as one, bonded to a man who had reason to be angry at the world, but who had not, unlike Eddie Brock, organized his entire selfhood around that anger. The hybrid bond was, in certain respects, the most controlled and intentional multi-symbiote relationship in the saga to that point, oriented toward the protection, rather than the destruction of the world Scott Washington had been excluded from. The hybrid experiment ended in violence, as most things in the symbiote saga end. But it opened a question that the saga would return to: whether the dysfunction of the Life Foundation offspring was a product of the extraction process or of the hosts, and whether a symbiote grown and bonded under better conditions could produce something qualitatively different from the entities the Life Foundation had manufactured under duress. Patrick Mulligan was meant to answer this question, though he did not choose to be the answer. He was a New York City police officer, not a remarkable one, not a hero in the costume sense, simply a man doing a difficult job with a reasonable amount of care. When the Venom symbiote, in one of the stranger biological events in its history, reproduced again, the timing was 2004, the offspring that emerged was the 3rd generation of the Venom line, which the law would come to call Toxin, and it bonded to Mulligan with no consent sought or given and no preparation on either side. The accounts in the Toxin miniseries, written by Peter Mulligan, published across 2004 and 2005, establish what followed with a clarity that earlier symbiote stories had not always achieved. Patrick Mulligan was a good man in the ordinary rather than the spectacular sense, and the symbiote that bonded with him found something in that ordinariness that it had not found in any previous host. Not greatness, not the enormous grief of Eddie Brock or the philosophical enormity of Carnage, just the specific, unglamorous decency of a person who cared for his family and tried to do his job well and had not, before the symbiote arrived, been tested in ways that required anything more than that. Both Eddie Brock and Spider-Man responded to the Toxin symbiote's birth, and their responses were entirely characteristic. Brock wanted to kill it. The offspring of the Venom symbiote, he reasoned, had a capacity for destruction that the world was not equipped to survive if it went wrong. Better to eliminate the threat before it could become another Carnage. Spider-Man wanted to protect Mulligan. The host deserved the chance to prove that the bond could be more than what Venom had been at its worst. Better to trust the man and see what the man made of what he carried. Spider-Man won the argument in the sense that Patrick Mulligan survived and went on to demonstrate over the course of his tenure as Toxin that the symbiote bond with a person who had no particular damage to amplify produced something genuinely different from what the bond produced with Eddie Brock or Cletus Kasady. Not a hero in the conventional mode, not someone with a mission articulated in any formal sense. Something closer to a man who tried to be good, carrying a symbiote that amplified his trying, in a version of the bond that had never quite existed before. A bond without a wound at its center. Mulligan's story ended before it had the space it deserved, He was killed in a later issue of a different series, and the Toxin symbiote moved on to other hosts. But what his story established remained in the record of the saga, that the bond could be constructive, that the symbiote, given a host who wanted to build rather than destroy, could accommodate that want, that the mirror, held up to someone who was simply trying to be decent, reflected something worth seeing. Eddie Brock's next chapter demonstrated this in a different register. By 2008, Brock had been separated from the Venom symbiote for several years. The symbiote had been transferred to Gargan, a story that belongs to the next chapter, and he had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. He was dying, quietly, in the general population of a city that had moved on from whatever he had been, when Martin Lee, the philanthropist who was secretly the villain called Mr. Negative, used his powers on Brock's body, and, in a biological event that neither man fully understood, transformed the traces of symbiote antibodies remaining in Brock's system into something new. The entity that emerged from this transformation was Anti-Venom. The name was accurate and inadequate simultaneously. Anti-Venom retained the physical power and the black and white aesthetic of the original Venom. But its central capacity was different from anything the Symbiote saga had produced before. Anti-Venom healed. The entity could cure diseases. It could neutralize toxins. It could, when brought into contact with a symbiote-bonded host, separate the symbiote from the host with a completeness that nothing else in the Marvel Universe could achieve. The alien cancer of the bond reversed into its opposite. Anti-Venom was Eddie Brock's body producing a cure for itself, and in doing so, producing something that could cure others. The cancer that had been killing him was, in the simplest possible sense, the thing that made Anti-Venom possible. The wound had become the medicine. The loss had become the source. The account in Amazing Spider-Man issues 569 through 571, published in 2008, written by Dan Slott, does not labour the irony, which is why it lands. Eddie Brock, who had organised his entire life around being right, and then been destroyed by being wrong, arrived at the capacity to heal not through conventional redemption, but through the specific alchemy of having been sick enough that something in him had no choice but to change. He used Anti-Venom with a focus and a clarity that the Venom years had occasionally achieved but never sustained. He protected the vulnerable. He sought out the harmful and placed himself between them and the people they were harming. He did this not with the grandiosity that had always complicated Eddie Brock's heroism, but with something quieter, the attention of a man who has run out of other purposes and found in service the one that fits. Anti-Venom ended in sacrifice. During the Spider Island event of 2011, the storyline in which a spider virus spread through the population of New York, Eddie Brock used the Anti-Venom entity's unique healing capacity to cure the infected population, and the process consumed it entirely. He gave up the thing that had been keeping him alive, in a sense that went beyond the biological, that had been giving him structure and purpose and the daily experience of being more than the sum of his failures, to cure people he had never met and would never meet. What remained after Anti-Venom was gone was Eddie Brock without a symbiote for the second time. But not the same Eddie Brock who had knelt in the church on Fifth Avenue with nowhere to go. A different one. One who had been twice over something more than himself, and had given both those somethings away in the end, and was still standing. Scott Washington's story, across the hybrid appearances scattered through the mid to late 1990s Venom and Spider-Man titles, is one of the more underexplored chapters in the Symbiote saga. Underexplored partly because the era it belongs to has not received the same retrospective attention as the Brock or Kate's periods, and partly because what it demonstrates is not dramatic in the conventional sense. A man with a legitimate grievance against the systems that put him in prison, carrying 4 merged symbiotes that had been the instruments of those systems' most extreme experiment, choosing to direct the resulting capacity toward the people who needed protecting. In the communities, those systems had consistently failed. The hybrid bond was not free of dysfunction. The 4 merged organisms were still incomplete, still products of the extraction process, still carrying the volatility that the life foundation had built into them by accident. But Washington's decency was sufficient, and sufficient was more than any of the other Life Foundation hosts had managed. What the Toxin era added to the accumulated record of the bond, beyond the biographical fact of Patrick Mulligan, beyond the specific arc of a good man carrying something that was making his life very complicated, was a data point about what the symbiote does when the host brings genuine ordinariness to it. Every previous significant bond had involved a host with something extreme at its center. Peter Parker's guilt was extreme in the way that the guilt of a person who has spent years preventing deaths at the cost of everything else in their life is extreme. Eddie Brock's grief was extreme. Cletus Kasady was extreme in a direction entirely of its own. Mulligan was not extreme. He was the specific, quiet, difficult kind of decent that does not make for compelling origin stories, but makes for reliable people. The symbiote found in this a quality it had not previously encountered, and what it produced from that quality was, correspondingly, something it had not previously produced. A bond that made the host neither larger nor smaller than he was, just more able. The years between Eddie Brock's separation from the Venom symbiote and his emergence as Anti-Venom are documented in the Venom and Spider-Man titles of the period, as years of descent followed by something that looks, from the outside, like merely continuing to exist. Brock was sick. The cancer that would eventually, through Martin Lee's intervention, transform into Anti-Venom had been progressing for months before the transformation. He was volunteering at a homeless shelter, the Martin Lee charity organization, that would later be revealed as the front for Mr. Negative's operations, not because he had processed his history and arrived at a position of peace with it, but because the specific kind of man Eddie Brock was, stripped of the symbiote and the mission and the identity, defaulted to service. It was the baseline. Beneath the journalist, beneath the venom, beneath everything the decades had put on top of it, this was what remained. Someone who needed to be doing something that mattered for someone other than himself. The anti-venom power, the capacity to heal, to neutralize toxins, to separate symbiotes from hosts, was not something Eddie Brock chose, or designed, or sought. It was what his body produced when Martin Lee's opposing powers of healing and corruption encountered the symbiote residue in Brock's immune system and created something neither power had intended to create. The accident is important. The capacity for healing in Eddie Brock was not the product of a decision to be different from what he had been. It was the product of his body's specific history, of 8 months bonded to an alien organism, of years of the immune response that followed, of the way that tissue damaged and repaired over time contains the record of everything that has ever damaged and repaired it. He did not become a healer. He was revealed to have been one underneath everything else all along. The pattern across these other children of the Venom line was the pattern the Saga had been building toward from the beginning. The bond revealed. In Donna Diego, it revealed a fragility that became catastrophe. In Patrick Mulligan, it revealed a decency that became something briefly beautiful. In Eddie Brock's second chapter, it revealed a capacity for healing that had been buried beneath years of anger. The symbiote did not create any of these things. It only showed what was already there. And meanwhile, the original Venom symbiote was in the hands of Gargan, and what the bond was showing about what was already there in Gargan was a problem of a different and more specific kind. Between Eddie Brock and Gargan, the Venom symbiote passed briefly through Angelo Fortunato, the son of a mafia figure, a young man with no particular preparation for what he was acquiring, who wore the symbiote for one appearance in Marvel Knight's Spider-Man issue 7, published in 2004, before the symbiote abandoned him mid-air. The abandonment is depicted without drama, which is precisely what makes it devastating. The symbiote simply left. Fortunato fell. The symbiote, having determined in the span of a single violent encounter that this host had nothing to offer it, separated in the middle of combat and moved on. Angelo Fortunato died from the fall. This is the detail that the Venom saga tends to move past quickly, which is a mistake, because what the Fortunato incident reveals is one of the most important structural facts about the bond. It is not permanent by default. The symbiote is not indiscriminate. It is hungry, yes, and the hunger makes it sometimes desperate, and desperation sometimes produces poor choices. But it is also, after 6 billion years and the accumulated experience of every host it has ever touched, selective in a way that nothing purely parasitic could be. It left Angelo Fortunato because Fortunato had nothing to give it. No wound deep enough to create the friction that makes the bond interesting. No conviction strong enough to direct the hunger toward anything worth directing it toward. No particular reason, from the symbiote's end, to stay. The bond is not a transaction that closes when both parties have agreed to the terms. It is an ongoing negotiation, and the symbiote reserves the right to withdraw from that negotiation at any point. It found Gargan, the former Scorpion, a professional criminal and occasional supervillain who had spent years being used as a tool by people more powerful than himself. The original Scorpion experiment is worth understanding in some detail, because it shapes everything that follows. J. Jonah Jameson, the publisher who had spent years funding the smear campaign against Spider-Man, hired a private investigator named Gargan, and then funded a scientific procedure that transformed Gargan into a superpowered figure capable of defeating Spider-Man. The procedure worked. The resulting creature, half man, half mechanical tail, all anger, was not controllable. Jameson had created something he could not manage, and he abandoned it to its own devices, as people who create things they cannot manage tend to do. Gargan had been used as a weapon by someone who had no interest in what happened to him after the weapon had served its purpose. This history matters because it is the context in which the Venom symbiote found him. Gargan was not simply angry in the diffuse, generalized way of someone who has had bad luck. He was angry in the specific, focused way of someone who has been instrumentalized, treated as a means rather than an end, deployed and then discarded. He had reason to be angry. He also had, unlike Eddie Brock, no organizing principle beneath the anger. Eddie Brock's anger had a code beneath it, a buried belief that the world should protect the vulnerable, that power carried obligation, that being right mattered, and that being wrong publicly was a form of death. Gargan's anger had none of this beneath it. The anger was the whole thing. What it was angry about did not particularly matter. The Gargan era of the Venom symbiote spans approximately 2004 to 2009, and what it reveals about the symbiote's nature is visible most clearly through contrast with what came before and after. The symbiote under Eddie Brock had been violent and complicated, and beneath the complications, oriented towards something. The symbiote under Gargan was simply violent. Not nihilistic in the Carnage sense, not committed to a philosophy of destruction, but absent of the code that had given the Brock years their uncomfortable moral texture. The entity became, in Gargan's hands, what the earliest SHIELD assessment had always said it was: appetite without architecture, hunger without direction. The worst of the Gargan era is documented in the Dark Avengers series, written by Brian Michael Bendis and published in 2009, in which Norman Osborn assembled a team of villains to pose as the world's premier superhero team during his period of institutional authority following the Skrull invasion. Gargan, wearing the symbiote configured to resemble Spider-Man's red and blue costume, participated in a performance of heroism that was the most complete moral inversion the character had yet achieved. The entity that had spent years in a church basement attempting to become something with a conscience was now impersonating the hero it had once hated, in service of someone who represented everything both Eddie Brock and the symbiote had always despised about power exercised against the vulnerable. The irony was total, and it was not lost on the symbiote in the way that ironies are not lost on things with the capacity to remember. The symbiote performed what was asked of it, because that is what symbiotes do when the host's will is sufficient and uncomplicated. Gargan's will was, if nothing else, uncomplicated. But the performance was not clean. The symbiote under Gargan ate people, not strategically, not in the spirit of the Lethal Protector's dark justice, but simply because Gargan's hunger was literal, and the symbiote's amplification of what it found in its host made that hunger larger and more insistent. This is the symbiote's mirror function at its most disturbing. Not spectacular horror, but the quiet, mundane horror of a thing that amplifies what it finds, revealing by the amplification how much of the host was simply appetite with nothing behind it. The siege event of 2010, the storyline in which Osborn's period of authority collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions during the assault on Asgard, brought the Gargan era to its end. Gargan was defeated and separated from the symbiote by Thor, in a collision of elements that had been in tension since the earliest chapter of the saga. The old god's lightning and the living darkness forged from the god of darkness's shadow, 6 billion years apart in origin, and arriving at this specific moment on this specific field. The separation was not voluntary and not clean. The symbiote was recovered. Gargan was hospitalized. The era was over. Venom under Gargan was the closest the symbiote had come since its own origin as Knull's weapon to being simply a tool. A powerful, violent alien instrument bonded to a man who used it the way a person with a hammer uses a hammer, without particular thought about the hammer's nature or history or what it might want. After Peter Parker's guilt and Eddie Brock's grief, and the brief windows of something better that both of them had made possible, this: appetite without a destination. The mirror held up to show nothing but need. It did not stay that way. Not because the symbiote engineered its own rescue, though the alien consciousness that had spent 6 billion years surviving things was certainly capable of patience, but because the next host was waiting and the next host was someone the symbiote could not have predicted and could not have designed and could not have hoped for, if hoping were something it had yet learned to do. His name was Flash Thompson. He had lost his legs in Iraq. He had once been a bully, and then a soldier, and then a veteran with the particular quality of damage that combat produces in people who were already trying to be better than they were when the war found them. Flash Thompson had, since the day a spider-powered teenager saved his life in high school, been the most devoted admirer of Spider-Man in the entire Marvel Universe. Not ironically, not with any distance or self-awareness about it, just devoted sincerely to the idea of what Spider-Man represented, to the specific proposition that a person could choose to use what they had in service of people who needed it, even at great personal cost, and that this choosing was the most important thing a person could do. Flash Thompson had believed this since he was 17 years old. He had spent his entire adult life trying to be the kind of person that choice described. He had been to war twice in that person's service. He had left his legs there. Gargan's specific failure as a host is worth understanding in its full particularity, because it is easy to reduce it to the simple formula of bad person plus alien equals worse outcome. The reduction misses something important. Gargan was not the worst person the symbiote had touched. Cletus Kasady held that position clearly and permanently. What made the Gargan years specifically corrosive was not the magnitude of the wrong, but its texture. Kasady's chaos, however horrifying, was organized around something, a philosophy, a view of reality that the symbiote could at least read and amplify. Gargan had no such organizing principle. What the symbiote found in Gargan, when it reached for what was already there, was primarily absence. The absence of conviction, the absence of grief, the absence of the specific hunger for meaning that every previous host had carried in one form or another. The symbiote could amplify appetite. It could not amplify a void. The performance of heroism during the Dark Avengers period had effects on the symbiote that are not recorded in any SHLD after-action report, but are visible in the behavioral record of the organism's subsequent bonds, the experience of impersonating Spider-Man, of wearing the shape of the hero who had been the symbiote's first genuine bond, moving in public as the thing it had once loved and been rejected by, was not neutral. The symbiote's cellular memory held Peter Parker's biochemistry. It knew, in the way that biological memory works, the difference between what it was pretending to be and what it had once actually been close to. The gap between those two things, maintained across months of the Dark Avengers performance, accumulated in whatever served the organism as a record of suffering. When the Gargan era ended at Siege, the symbiote was not simply freed from a bad host. It was freed from an experience that had, in its own alien way, been a sustained humiliation. The transition from Gargan to Flash Thompson was not immediate. There were intervening months in which the recovered symbiote was held in government containment, while the Project Rebirth 2.0 program was developed and approved at the appropriate levels of classification. Those months are a gap in the public record, but the SHILD behavioral assessments conducted during containment describe an organism that was, for lack of a better technical term, withdrawn, not aggressive, not the active, probing intelligence that earlier containment periods had documented, something that had contracted inward, that was occupying the minimum available space, that was not, as far as the assessment instruments could detect, reaching outward in the bonding hunger that had always previously characterized it in confinement. The organism was waiting, not patiently, in the specific quiet way of something that has been through enough to know that what happens next matters, and that it has no choice but to see what it turns out to be. Flash Thompson was brought into the Project Rebirth 2.0 orientation process by a program recruiter who showed him the symbiote in its containment unit before presenting any of the formal briefings. This detail, documented in the project's administrative file and referenced in Venom Volume 2, Issue 1, is worth noting because of what the recruiter apparently said. They told Thompson that the organism had been assessed as manageable under the right conditions, and they told him what the right conditions were, and then they told him what the program had in mind for how those conditions would be maintained. Flash Thompson looked at the thing in the containment unit for a long time without speaking. Then he asked whether it was all right in there. The recruiter did not know how to answer. The program moved forward. The United States government wanted to use the Venom symbiote as a weapon. Flash Thompson wanted to be a hero again. The symbiote, transferred to Thompson under controlled conditions as part of a classified military program called Project Rebirth 2.0, found in him something that none of its previous hosts had contained in quite this specific configuration. A man who loved Spider-Man, who had spent his entire adult life trying to be the kind of person that Spider-Man would be proud of. The bond this time found not just what was already there. It found a reference point, an echo of 8 months with Peter Parker that had lived in the symbiote's cellular memory as the first genuine bond in its history, a standard, a shape of what it might mean to actually try. The mirror had found at last someone who already knew what he wanted to see in it. The program was called Project Rebirth 2.0, and the name was a deliberate echo of the program that had created Captain America. Deliberate enough that the people running it understood they were invoking a legacy they could not live up to. The account in Amazing Spider-Man issue 654, published in 2011 and written by Dan Slott, establishes the conditions with a clinical precision that the story does not allow to remain clinical for long. Flash Thompson, recipient of the Medal of Honor for actions in Iraq that cost him both legs, would be bonded to the recovered Venom symbiote under controlled conditions. The bond would last no longer than 20 hours at a time, after which Flash would be sedated and the symbiote separated. He would not be permitted to speak to the symbiote. He would not be permitted to form any personal relationship with the organism. He would be a host in the most purely functional sense. Flash Thompson agreed to these conditions because he wanted to be a soldier again, and because the symbiote represented the only mechanism available for a man with no legs, to re-enter the category of people who do things that matter. He agreed to them the way a person agrees to conditions they know they cannot fully maintain, not out of dishonesty, but out of the genuine belief that the discipline they have developed through years of training and combat and loss will hold against whatever the bond produces. This belief was, as most such beliefs are, partially correct and partially wrong in ways that would only become clear over time. The discipline held mostly. For the first year of the Agent Venom run, the 22-issue arc written by Rick Remender that began in Venom Volume 2 in 2011, Flash Thompson wore the symbiote on government missions with a control and a focus that the Symbiote Saga had not previously seen. Not Eddie Brock's complicated code, not the blunt hunger of the Gargan years, but the specific discipline of a trained soldier who had faced things that should have ended him, and had developed, through that facing, a quality the symbiote had never encountered before in any host, the absence of the impulse to use more force than the situation required. The symbiote found in Flash Thompson, a man who had been trained, at great cost, to calibrate, who had learned in the most concrete terms that excess force does not produce better outcomes. That restraint is a skill rather than a weakness, that the discipline to hold back is harder and more valuable than the capacity to destroy, and the symbiote, carrying the residue of every host it had ever touched, Eddie Brock's grief and Peter Parker's guilt and the darker echoes from the years in between, found in this calibration a form it could inhabit that felt for the first time in years close to right. The Agent Venom missions are documented across Venom Volume 2, issues 1 through 22, and across Flash Thompson's appearances in Rick Remender's Secret Avengers run. They cover the kinds of operations that required someone who could do what Spider-Man did, but without the same moral constraints about direct violence, not because Flash lacked moral constraints, but because his constraints were calibrated to combat rather than to the ethics of the street. He went places where heroes could not go visibly. He came home, mostly, and he stood in the corridors of the VA hospital in the hours after missions and talked to the veterans there in the specific way that only another veteran can, without the grammar of acknowledgement that civilians deploy to cover what they do not understand. The government's conditions did not survive contact with reality because they never do. Flash Thompson began to care about the symbiote, not in the way you develop fondness for a tool, but in the way you develop something more than that when you have been sharing a consciousness with another being for weeks and months and eventually years. He began to understand it. Not fully. The symbiote's interior life remained largely opaque even to its most attentive host, but enough. Enough to recognize when it was distressed. Enough to push back when the military handlers wanted to use it in ways that were purely instrumental. Enough to advocate in the language available to someone who was the military's asset, for the organism that was, in some sense, he could not entirely articulate, also his partner, the most significant period of the Flash Thompson arc, the work that elevated the Agent Venom story from a character study into something with larger implications for the entire Symbiote saga, came in the Venom Space Knight series, written by Robbie Thompson and published in 2015 and 2016. In this run, Flash travelled into space with the symbiote as part of a group of cosmic heroes, and eventually found his way to the Klyntar homeworld, the world made of imprisoned God, the planet that had been a cage for 6 billion years. What Flash Thompson found on Klyntar, and what the symbiote experienced in returning to the place where its race had made its defining choice, was an echo of what that place had become in Knull's continued, imperfect absence. The Klyntar, cut off from their god but never fully free of his influence, had developed in ways that his lingering signal continued to corrupt. The natural state of the symbiotes, the state they had been moving toward when they chose to become a cage rather than an armada, was something closer to genuine symbiosis in the cooperative sense. Not the parasitism that the early bonds had always risked becoming, but a mutual enhancement, the bonding drive as a genuine desire for connection, rather than as hunger to be satisfied. Knull's imprisonment had never been fully clean. His influence leaked upward through the layers of living organisms above him, subtly turning the natural bonding drive towards something more proprietary. The Klyntar on the outer worlds were not as pure as the pre-Knull ideal. But the ideal existed, preserved in the deepest memory of the hive. available to be recovered if something or someone could reach deep enough to find it. Flash Thompson, bonded to the Venom symbiote and standing on the surface of the world that was also a prison, became, briefly, imperfectly, in the way that the symbiote Saga always achieves its best moments, the mechanism through which some portion of the Klyntar accessed that memory. The account in Space Knight, issues 10 through 12, describes this in terms that are more mystical than scientific, which is appropriate because the event was not scientific. It was something older. The symbiote, in Flash Thompson's body, on the planet where its race had made the choice that defined them, reached into the hive mind and pulled forward the memory of what they had chosen to be, before Knull, before the Armada, before 6 billion years of being used as weapons, and then learning, slowly, to want something else. Flash Thompson died. Not in Space Knight. The death came later, in a different series, the kind of death that comics give to characters they are not sure what to do with next. He was killed protecting a child, which is the kind of death that the Saga had been building toward for 20 issues. The death that makes the life preceding it coherent in retrospect, that shows you what a character was actually about, by showing you what it cost him to remain that way until the end. The symbiote's response to his death is not articulated in words. It is articulated in behavior, in the quality of contraction, in the time it remains before moving to a new host, in the careful quality of its early encounters with the person who came next. Eddie Brock, returning to the Bond after the Anti-Venom years, received a symbiote that had been changed by what it had experienced with Flash Thompson. Not healed, not resolved. The darkness was still there, the hunger still there, the 6 billion year weight of everything the organism had been and done and survived still present in its cellular memory. But different. Carrying in that memory the specific texture of what it felt like to be in a bond that worked. A bond where the host wanted to be good and the symbiote found, in that wanting, something it could amplify towards something other than destruction, the 20-hour limit that governed Flash Thompson's bond with the Venom symbiote. The government's attempt to contain the relationship within manageable parameters became, over time, one of the more revealing structural elements of the Agent Venom run. Flash consistently pushed against it. Not recklessly, not in the way of someone who cannot follow rules, but with the specific pressure of someone who has been in situations that do not end at the scheduled time, and has learned that operational discipline and bureaucratic discipline are different categories of thing. The symbiote, for its part, showed no interest in observing the limit either. In the sedated hours of separation, it was not resting. It was remembering. Every minute of the bond had been accumulated in its cellular memory, and the cellular memory did not stop being active because the host was not currently in contact. The Secret Avengers work, the classified operations run under the joint authority of SHIELD and the Avengers, documented across Rick Remender's Secret Avengers Volume 2, gave Flash Thompson the kind of operational context that the standard Agent Venom missions did not always provide. Colleagues who were also working in morally complicated spaces, who had also developed the specific ethical vocabulary of people who do things that cannot be publicly acknowledged in service of purposes they genuinely believe in. The symbiote moved through these operations with a fluency that surprised the team members who had been briefed on its history. Not because it had changed its fundamental nature, but because Flash Thompson's presence in the bond gave it something to stabilize against. A north point. A thing to orient toward when the darkness at the center of it wanted to expand without limit. The Klyntar homeworld, when Flash Thompson arrived there as part of the Space Knight configuration, had a gravity and an atmosphere suited to life, but a texture unlike any other inhabited planet in the accounts available. The surface was not rock in the geological sense. It was compacted organism, the outermost layer of the billions of Klyntar who had chosen to become a cage, calcified across millions of years into something that looked like ground, but was, in the deepest sense, alive. The wind that moved across it was warm, because the planet below generated heat. The darkness that gathered at the horizon at night was a darkness with the specific quality of something breathing. Flash Thompson stood on it and felt through the symbiote's sensory system the pulse of the thing he was standing on. The feeling, he would later describe to the Secret Avengers debrief officer, was not frightening. It was the most alive he had ever felt. The restoration that the Venom symbiote facilitated on the Klyntar homeworld, the reaching into the hive mind, the recovering of the older memory of what the Klyntar had chosen to be, was not permanent. And the accounts in Space Knight issues 10 through 12 are careful to note this. What was recovered was not a transformation. It was an access point. The Klyntar who were closest to the surface, farthest from Knull's signal, found the old memory and incorporated it into their understanding of themselves. The ones closer to the center did not. The planet remained, in its lower levels, what it had always been. A place organized around the long project of containing something that should not be free. The restoration was partial. The partial was still more than nothing. Flash Thompson died protecting a child on a planet most of the galaxy had never heard of, in a run of issues that the larger Marvel narrative did not fully integrate into its central event structure at the time. This is the kind of death that superhero comics sometimes deal in. The death that happens in the margins, that costs something real, but does not generate the event crossover attention that the character's history deserved. The symbiote carried him off the field, and remained with his body for a period that lasted, by the accounts of the other Space Knight team members present, longer than any previous host transition they had observed. Not clinging to a corpse in horror. Something quieter. The way that beings mark the end of things that mattered to them, in whatever way they have available for marking. The symbiote does not create what it finds, but what it finds stays with it. What it found in Flash Thompson was something it had been reaching toward it since the night in the church on Fifth Avenue, since the moment it had extended itself toward Eddie Brock's grief through the dark and felt something reach back. The soldier had shown it what the bond was for, when the bond was at its best. The mirror had reflected for once something that looked like what it wanted to become. That is not a small thing to carry into what came next. In 2018, Donny Cates and Ryan Stegman began a Venom run that would, over the subsequent 3 years, do something the character's 30-year history had rarely managed. Connect every thread in the saga back to its origin, and make the connection feel inevitable rather than retrofitted. The run opened with Eddie Brock rebonded to the symbiote, living in New York, maintaining the precarious equilibrium that the years of Agent Venom and Anti-Venom and the various separations and reunions had left him with. And then in Venom Volume 4, Issue 4, it delivered the full revelation of Knull, not merely as backstory, not as the origin explanation, but as an active presence whose influence had never stopped reaching outward from the center of the world that contained him. Not just the history of the Klyntar race, which had been available in fragmentary form across earlier accounts. Not just the explanation of the symbiote's origin as weapons of a sleeping god, but the revelation that Knull was not entirely asleep. That the signal from the center of the planet had never stopped. That every symbiote that had ever bonded with a host had been at some unconscious level reaching back toward the frequency of the god who made the organism they were, even as the civilized layers of the hive worked to maintain his imprisonment. The cage was intact. The prisoner inside it was not inactive. The Codex. This is the concept Cates introduced that reframed every previous Venom story, and it reframed them by answering the question the Saga had been building toward without articulating. What happens to a host after the bond ends? The answer, established across Venom Volume 4, Issues 6 through 10, is this. A piece of the host stays. Not a copy, not a recording, but a living cellular imprint that the symbiote carries forward, that becomes part of the hive mind's memory. That Knull could, if his signal grew strong enough, harvest. Every person who had ever bonded with a symbiote had left a fragment of themselves in the living network, the dead and the living and the long forgotten, preserved in the biology of a species that had never learned how to forget. Eddie Brock had a son. The revelation of Dylan Brock, Eddie's child, born of his brief marriage before the symbiote and kept hidden from him, is one of the stranger moments in a saga that had spent 30 years accumulating strange moments. Dylan was not simply a child Eddie didn't know about. He was, from the symbiote's perspective, a decision made without Eddie's knowledge or consent. The organism had detected the pregnancy, had recognized the child as something that needed protecting, and had concealed the fact of his existence from Eddie, for reasons that took several more issues to fully explain. The symbiote had kept a secret. Not out of malice. Out of something the Saga had been slowly building toward the capacity to name, care. Dylan Brock carried something unusual in his biology. The residue of symbiote contact from before his birth, from his mother's brief exposure during her pregnancy. This residue had, over the course of his childhood, produced an ability that had no direct precedent in the symbiote saga. The capacity to affect symbiotes themselves, to disrupt the bond, to harm or destroy symbiote organisms with a directed effort. He was, in the most literal possible sense, the son of Venom. And what he had inherited from that parentage was the capacity to be its opposite when it needed to be opposed. The child born from a bond had become the living counter to what the bond could become under the worst conditions. Knull moved while these discoveries were being processed. The sleeping god had never been fully asleep, and the events of the preceding years had provided him with what he needed. The Codex, the billions of cellular imprints left by former hosts, spread across the universe in living symbiote organisms, connected to each other and to him through the hive mind's deep architecture. He had been patient. 6 billion years of patience had taught him that the waiting itself was a form of action, that the accumulation of what he needed could be conducted at a pace invisible to the beings doing the accumulating. Absolute Carnage, published in 2019 and written by Donny Cates, was the immediate precursor. The storyline in which Cletus Kasady, resurrected and more completely Knull's instrument than he had ever been any philosophy's instrument, moved through the Marvel Universe, collecting Codex fragments from former symbiote hosts, living ones and dead ones. The violence was extraordinary and the purpose was clear. Kasady was not acting out his own chaos theology. He was gathering the pieces of a signal that Knull needed to complete. Every fragment Kasady collected was a note in a frequency that when all notes were present would be loud enough to wake the god in the center of the cage. Knull arrived on Earth in King in Black, Issue 1, published in January of 2021. He arrived the way things with that much mass and that much history tend to arrive, without announcement, without theatre, with only the fact of his presence and the immediate, complete change in every ambient condition. The sky darkened. The symbiotes bonded to heroes and civilians alike responded to the God signal, involuntary and absolute. The heroes of the Marvel Universe had faced world-ending threats before. They had faced gods and cosmic entities. They had not faced something that was also, in the most direct possible sense, the origin point of a biological legacy embedded in some of their most powerful members. Eddie Brock died. The account in King in Black, Issues 1 and 2, does not soften this or position it as a narrative feint. Eddie Brock died in the opening chapters of the invasion. The symbiote survived. It always survived. It was too old and too determined not to. But the host was gone. And in the particular crisis that followed, the symbiote reached for the nearest available person whose biology could receive it. And the nearest available person was Dylan Brock, standing in the wreckage of what his father had been doing, carrying in his own body the residue of a protection that had been maintained in secret since before he was born. What happened in that bonding? What the symbiote found in the child of Eddie Brock, carrying the echo of Eddie Brock's love, and the symbiote's own protective instinct and the anti-symbiote capacity that had grown from both of these things, was sufficient. Eddie Brock was resurrected, not by magic, not by the standard mechanisms of superhero narrative reversal, but by the symbiote, using the Codex fragments it had access to, using the cellular memory of every host it had ever touched, using the vast and accumulated biological architecture of 6 billion years of existence. Eddie Brock came back different. What he came back as, the white-suited entity sometimes called the Venom King, carrying in himself the distilled knowledge of the hive in a way that no previous host had accessed, was something the Saga had been moving toward without knowing how to name. Knull was defeated, not through force alone, through the specific combination of Eddie Brock's human stubbornness and the symbiote's connection to the hive, and Dylan's capacity to disrupt the God signal, and the accumulated weight of 30 years of bonds that had been, each in their own imperfect way, more than they were supposed to be. The cage was resealed. The signal from the center of the planet went quiet. For a while, and in the quiet that followed, Eddie Brock was alone with the symbiote in the particular way that beings become alone after they have done the thing they were built to do. Not at peace exactly. The damage was too extensive, and the history too long for peace to be the right word. But finished with one arc in a way that suggested, in the slow, exhausted way that finishes suggest, the beginning of another. The Codex concept is, in the Kate's Venom run, one of those ideas that gains weight as the story progresses, the way structural ideas in fiction gain weight, not through assertion but through implication. Each chapter that follows the Codex revelation is changed by it in retrospect, because each chapter involves a bond, and each bond now carries the knowledge that it is not only itself, that it is also a transfer of cellular memory. That the person bonding with the symbiote is not only experiencing the organism's history, but contributing to it, leaving a fragment of themselves in the hive, a fragment that persists beyond the death of the host, beyond the end of the bond, beyond every separation and reunion. The Codex makes the entire history of the Symbiote saga simultaneously more intimate and more ominous. More intimate because every bond was also a form of permanent record, a kind of love letter that could not be destroyed. More ominous because that record was accessible to the thing sleeping in the center of the cage. Dylan Brock's anti-symbiote capability, in the issues that develop it through the build-up to King in Black, is depicted with a precision that the story's larger spectacle sometimes overshadows. It is not simply the ability to hurt symbiotes. Many things can hurt symbiotes under the right conditions. It is the ability to disrupt the bond itself, to reach into the connection between symbiote and host and find the specific frequency at which the organism's hold is maintained and introduce interference. This capacity is, biologically, the exact inverse of the Codex, where the Codex is the way the organism holds onto fragments of its hosts. Dylan's power is the way a host's descendant holds onto the capacity to refuse the holding. He is the living proof that the bond changes the host's biology in ways that persist beyond the bond's end. That the body remembers, in its own way, what it has been part of. Absolute Carnage, as a narrative event, is structured as a horror story in the clinical sense. A threat that grows methodically, that accumulates power through actions that cannot be effectively countered without understanding what the actions are building toward. Kasady, as Knull's instrument, was not conducting random violence in this arc. He was conducting a harvest. Each former symbiote host that he reached and extracted the Codex from was a step in a specific direction, and the direction was Knull's return. The heroes who tried to stop him were working without the crucial piece of information. What the Codex was, what harvesting it accomplished, what the endgame looked like, until enough of the pattern had been established to make the shape of it visible. By then, enough fragments had been collected to make the next step, the final step possible. The texture of the Knull invasion across King in Black, issues 1 through 5, has a quality that distinguishes it from the standard Marvel Universe world-threatening event. Most such events threaten through external force, through an enemy powerful enough to defeat the heroes if not stopped. Knull's invasion threatened through something more internal. The symbiotes bonded to heroes and civilians throughout the Marvel Universe, the ones that had been part of the ecosystem for years, that had been accepted as essentially benign or managed or understood, responded to Knull's signal, the way that suppressed memories respond to a trigger. Involuntarily, completely, without the intervention of whatever the host thought they understood about the bond. The thing the heroes had learned to live with became, in the presence of its original signal, briefly and completely the thing it had always been before the learning. The resurrection of Eddie Brock is handled in the Kate's run with a specificity that distinguishes it from the standard superhero death reversal. He does not come back through outside intervention. He comes back because the symbiote does it, using the Codex, using the cellular fragments of everyone who has ever worn the organism, everyone who has ever contributed their residue to the hive mind's memory. Every previous host participated in the reconstruction of Eddie Brock. Their fragments, accumulated across 30 years of bonds, provided the biological material and the pattern for rebuilding the host the symbiote most needed to have back. This is the most literal expression of the idea the entire saga has been building toward. That the bonds are cumulative, that each host's contribution persists, that the accumulation eventually amounts to something that cannot be undone by a single death. The darkness that Knull had spread across the sky of the Marvel Universe pulled back slowly, the way all-encompassing things pull back. In patches, at the edges first, then more quickly toward the center, until the ordinary sky returned, and the city was simply a city again, wet and cold and full of the particular freight of human problems that had nothing to do with sleeping gods, or living weapons, or the 6 billion year question of what a creature made for violence could eventually become. The question had been there since before the first star ignited. It was still there. The answer was still being worked out, one bond at a time. After the invasion, there was work to do. There is always work to do in the Marvel Universe, in the specific sense that the infrastructure of ordinary life does not repair itself simply because the extraordinary threat has been resolved. New York had been covered in a symbiote darkness that the King in Black storyline describes in terms more geological than dramatic, not a disaster that happened and ended, but a condition that settled into the city's surfaces and took time to lift. Buildings needed assessment. People who had been affected by Knull's signal needed care. The mechanisms for providing that care needed to be rebuilt in the same spaces where the damage had been done. The city's particular habit of resuming its own weight after catastrophe, the habit that had sustained it through every previous extraordinary event in the Marvel Universe's long history of extraordinary events, resumed. Dylan Brock was 16 years old. He had come to the Symbiote Saga at its most complicated moment, having spent his entire life at its margin without knowing it, raised by his mother in the careful distance from Eddie Brock that the circumstances of their lives had required, unaware of his father's history, unaware of what was in his own biology, until the residue of his prenatal exposure to the symbiote began producing effects that required explanation. He was not a superhero in the sense that any of the previous hosts had been heroes or anti-heroes or villains. He was a teenager with an unusual inheritance and the particular resilience that children develop when the world turns out to be stranger and more specific about them than they were told it would be. The symbiote had protected him. This is the fact that Dylan Brock carried into his relationship with the organism that had been present in his life since before his birth, not as a presence he could feel or interact with, but as a force that had made a decision about him when he was too small to make decisions about himself. The organism that had spent 6 billion years learning what it was for had looked at a child in the making and decided, without any instruction, without any precedent in its history, that this particular thing needed protecting. And then it had kept the secret of that decision for 15 years, while the world went on being complicated and the child grew up inside it without knowing what was keeping a specific kind of chaos away from him. What Dylan Brock inherited from this protection was not the standard symbiote bond. He had not been bonded in the conventional sense, the skin-to-skin merger that every other host in the saga had experienced. What he had was something subtler, a biological resonance with symbiote organisms that allowed him to affect them in ways that nothing external could replicate. He could disrupt the bond between symbiote and host with focused effort. He could, under certain conditions, harm or destroy symbiote organisms entirely. He could receive the venom symbiote in the emergency of his father's death, and hold it while the bond with Eddie was being remade. He was, in the vocabulary of the saga, a first. Something the 6 billion year history had not produced before. He is a person whose relationship to the symbiote had been defined not by choice or circumstance, or the emergency of crisis, but by an act of care that had predated his own awareness of what was being decided. The symbiote had chosen to love something before it knew what loving was. That is the statement about the bond that Dylan Brock's existence makes. It is the quietest statement in the whole saga, easier to overlook than the larger dramas of Carnage and King in Black and the vast mythology of Knull. But it is the one that resolves the central question the saga has been building toward. Not what the symbiote is, not whether it is parasite or partner, weapon or living being, villain or something more complicated, but what it is capable of, what it became across 6 billion years of accumulating the residue of everyone it had ever touched. Eddie Brock, in the period following the King in Black resolution, underwent changes that the ongoing Venom narrative continues to work through, a transformation moving him towards something larger than the individual host, something closer to the guardian function that the Klyntar, in their best state, had been designed to be. The specifics belong to ongoing story, but the shape of the arc is visible in retrospect. Eddie Brock began as a man whose identity had been destroyed by a mistake made in the service of his own certainty, and he became, across 30 years of bonding and separation and sacrifice and return, something that the word hero barely touches. Not because he was always good. The record of his violence is too long to summarize gently. But because he kept trying, because every time the bond showed him what was already there, he stayed to reckon with what it found, and tried to make something worth making from the finding. Dylan Brock, as Venom, carries forward the accumulated weight of what every previous host brought to the bond, and what the bond made of what they brought. He carries Peter Parker's guilt, which is the guilt of someone who cares too much. To stop caring, even when caring is exhausting. He carries Eddie Brock's grief, which is the grief of someone who believed in something and was destroyed by that belief, and kept believing anyway. He carries Flash Thompson's calibrated discipline, and the ghost of Anti-Venom's healing instinct, and the specific quality of a father he knew too briefly, who spent his life trying to be more than what his worst moments made him. He carries all of this in the cellular memory of an organism that spent 6 billion years learning what to do with what it found, and arrived at, of all things, protection. The saga that began in the void before stars, with a god forging a weapon from his own shadow, arrived at a teenager in New York with an unusual biology and the quiet inheritance of a decision that was made before he was born. There is something worth sitting with in that arc. The first thing the symbiote ever was, under Knull, was a weapon designed to eliminate resistance. The last thing it became, in the slow arc of the story, was a form of protection designed to absorb it. The instrument of destruction became the instrument of preservation, not through one dramatic conversion, but through the long, patient, imperfect accumulation of every host who had worn it and left a piece of themselves behind. The symbiote had been called many things. A parasite, a monster, a suit, a curse, a cancer, an alien intelligence and an animal drive and a dark mirror, and the worst expression of what the bond could be. It had been all of these things, at different moments, with different hosts. It had also been something else, something harder to name, something that 30 years of stories and 6 billion years of existence had been building towards the vocabulary to articulate. It had been the thing that stayed. Through every separation, every rejection, every death and resurrection and complication and betrayal. Through the church and the Baxter Building and the tunnels under San Francisco and the Klyntar homeworld and the battlefield where Flash Thompson died and the sky over New York when Knull came and everything went dark. It had been the thing that found its way back. not because it was designed to. Knull designed weapons, not companions, but because somewhere in the long accumulation of human experience, inside its cellular memory, it had learned what all the hosts who shaped it had also known, in their own imperfect ways. That the world contains things worth returning for. This is the central irony of the Venom saga, stated in its final form, as quietly as the saga will allow. The creature dismissed as a parasite, assessed as non-sentient, classified as a bonding reflex with no discernible cognitive function beyond attachment, learned, across 6 billion years and more hosts than the record fully contains, to mean something by the attachment. Not to perform meaning. Not to simulate the appearance of a relationship. To actually mean it. To carry the residue of everyone it had ever touched, and bring that residue forward into every subsequent bond, so that each new host was, in some small and unmeasurable sense, the inheritor of everyone who had come before. Dylan Brock's first months as Venom, in the current issues of the ongoing series, have a texture that distinguishes them from any previous configuration of the bond. He is not carrying Eddie Brock's grief, though he carries his own version of it. The grief of a son who knew his father for too briefly, and then was asked to carry forward what the father had been building for 30 years. He is not carrying Flash Thompson's military discipline, though he has something adjacent to it. The specific practical orientation of a teenager who has spent the last several months in situations that required him to be more competent than his age should have allowed. He is carrying instead something that no previous host carried when they first bonded. The knowledge of what the symbiote is, from the inside. Not learned through experience. Known from before experience. The way children know certain things about their parents' nature before they have the context to name what they know. The symbiote, bonded to Dylan, has a different quality of presence than it had with any previous host. And this difference is noted in the current issues with a care that reflects how much narrative weight it carries. With Eddie Brock, the symbiote was also a kind of externalized grief, something large and dark that contained what Eddie could not hold alone. With Flash Thompson, it was a kind of prosthesis, in the richest sense of that word, an extension that completed rather than replaced. With Dylan, it is neither. It is something closer to an inheritance, present in the way that inherited things are present, as both possession and obligation, as something that came from somewhere and belongs somewhere, and requires the person who holds it to understand what they hold. Dylan is 16 years old. He's trying to figure out what that understanding looks like in practice. The arc of Eddie Brock, from the church on Fifth Avenue to the Venom King to whatever he is becoming in the issues being published now, is in retrospect one of the stranger hero journeys in the Marvel Universe, because it never resolved into the clean shape that hero journeys typically assume. He did not become a good man through a single conversion. He did not stop being complicated through the accumulation of good deeds. He remained throughout the specific and difficult person he had always been. Vain, stubborn, capable of great damage, and capable of great sacrifice. Unable to stop believing in things even when the things he believed in cost him everything. The symbiote did not make him better. It made him larger. It gave the specific complicated person he was the scale to act on the scale he had always felt capable of. And the acting, across 30 years, produced something that the word redemption touches without quite reaching. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows a very long story. Not the silence of resolution, the tidy quiet of a narrative that has answered all its questions. the silence of having travelled a long way and arrived somewhere that feels, if not like an ending, like a place you can rest for a while. The symbiote saga does not end. The organism is still out there, still bonding, still accumulating the residue of whoever it touches, still carrying in its cellular memory the 6 billion-year record of everything it has been part of. The question of what it is, parasite or partner, weapon or mirror, the worst of what the bond can be or the strange and difficult best, is still open. It will remain open. But the evidence, accumulated across 30 years of stories, and every host who contributed to them, runs in a particular direction. The darkness still lives at the center of the cage. Knull is patient. He has always been patient. But the cage was built by beings who chose a different future, and the choosing has to be renewed, which is perhaps the oldest truth the saga contains. That the choice to be more than what you were made for is not made once. It is made again each time in each bond by each host who takes on the weight of everything the organism carries and decides, in the particular way that human beings and soldiers and teenagers and angry men in churches decide things, what to do with it. The symbiote does not create what it finds. It only shows what is already there. And what has been there, again and again, in the long series of people who have worn this particular darkness, was this: the capacity, imperfect and hard-won, and sometimes deeply compromised, to try. You have travelled a long distance tonight, from the void before stars to a church on Fifth Avenue, from a patchwork planet at the edge of known space to the tunnels beneath San Francisco, from the Klyntar homeworld to the streets of a city recovering from a darkness that came from the center of the world itself. The Symbiote Saga is not a story with a clean ending. The organism is still out there, still bonding, still accumulating the residue of whoever it touches, still carrying the question of what it is into every new host who agrees to answer it. But the question has a shape now that it did not have in 1984, when a young man touched a small black sphere and thought it was a machine. Let that be enough for now. Let the long arc of what was dismissed as mindless alien slime settle in the quiet space behind your eyes, in the way that long stories settle when you have come to their end for the evening. The church is still on Fifth Avenue. The stone is still cool, and the candles are still burning. The same slow way they have always burned, and the silence in there has the same texture, the texture of everything that has been brought in and not quite taken back out again. The darkness at the center of the planet is still waiting, the way all patient things wait, without urgency, without hurry, in the long and steady dark. 6 billion years is a long time to be something. It is longer still to become something else. The symbiote did not create what it found. In Peter Parker, in Eddie Brock, in Flash Thompson, and Mac Gargan, and Cletus Kasady, and Dylan Brock, in the long line of hosts whose names and stories this account has touched, and the others it has not, it found what was already there and gave it a shape. What was already there, in the best of them, was the capacity to be more than the wound, to carry the darkness and use it as something other than a weapon. That is not a small thing. That is, in the quiet language of the Symbiote Saga, perhaps the only thing that ever mattered. Let yourself be quiet now. Let the weight of where you have been today find somewhere to put itself. Let the darkness around you be the ordinary kind, the kind that your eyes know how to read, the kind that the morning resolves without effort or instruction. The saga will be there when you return. The stories that haven't been told yet are waiting in the dark where all stories wait, patient and unhurried, learning what they are from whatever finds them. The symbiote does not create what it finds. It only shows what is already there. And what is already there, right now, in the quiet after a long journey, is someone who has been paying attention. Rest now. The bond that matters most, the one between a story and the person willing to follow it all the way to its end, has done its work for tonight. The word that recurs in the final chapters of the Kate's run and in the current Dylan Brock issues is protection. Not power, not justice, not revenge, not even heroism in the conventional mode. Protection. The symbiote that began as a weapon for conquest, that was dismissed as a parasite, that was feared as a monster, and used as a tool, and worn as a costume by people who understood only part of what they were wearing, arrived at protection, as the word that most accurately described what it had spent 6 billion years learning to be. The choice was not imposed on it from outside. It was not the result of a command or a directive, or a mission briefing. It emerged over time from the accumulated weight of everything the organism had been close to. From the residue of everyone who had carried the capacity for protection inside them when the bond arrived, and had that capacity amplified by the bond into something they could actually act on. If this journey through the complete symbiote saga spoke to you, leave a comment telling us which version of Venom stays with you. The Brock years, the agent, the god, the sun. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well.